Last week we discussed the bone histology. What does the bone tissue actually look like? We also discussed long bone, short bone, all that stuff. We're going to actually talk now about naming these bones and some of the markings on those bones that make those bones what they are. Easiest thing to start off with is first discussing the divisions of the skeleton, which we can lump it into two different parts. An axial skeleton and an appendicular skeleton. I could read this, but I'm going to go ahead and just let you all read that on your own. We're going to go ahead and just look at this picture right here. You have 286 bones, 80 of which are with the axial. The other 206 are part of your appendicular skeleton. How do you remember these names? Look at the names, just the very first names that'll help you determine what they are. Axial, right smack dab down the middle. Just like the Earth's axis. The Earth turns on its axis, its center point. So that's kind of what's going on here. You kind of have that spinal cord being that axis, right smack down the middle. Bones that pertain to it are your skull, your spinal column, your coccyx, your sacrum. Coccyx is just a fancy word for tailbone, and your ribs. The appendicular skeleton contains your scapula, your clavicle, as well as your pelvis, and the bones that pertain to it, and your limbs. Easy way to remember this. Another word for a limb or an extremity is an appendage. So this appendicular skeleton is talking about your appendages. Appendicular, appendage. Hopefully that makes sense. We do need to go ahead and talk about the different types of bones. Again, we talked about the long bones earlier. Anything that's longer than its width is considered a long bone. So even the bones right here in the hand, these metacarpals, are considered long bones. Short bones are about the same width and height. So like your carpals in your wrist. Flat bones like your skull, your sternum. And then you can have yourself some irregular bones, which kind of don't really fit neatly into these three. And finally, you have one type of bone that's a sesamoid bone. That's your patella, your kneecap. The reason why it's called a sesamoid, it kind of looks like a sesame seed. So that's called a sesamoid. It's a seed bone. We do need to talk about the different types of bone markings and what gives them what. We're not going to name them. We're not going to name specific ones right now. We're just going to name like bits and pieces. So for instance, sutural bones, that's just referring to bones that look like they are fused together via sutures, like a sloppy job done by a doctor. Look at those terrible sutures between those two bones. So let's begin a lot more in depth about the bone surface and the bone structures. Most discussions about bone markings don't just leave out what is a foramen, what is this, what is that, what do these nomenclatures mean. But I found that discussing what those mean and how they fit into groups really helps students really grasp the bone markings and help remember them. So without further ado, let's discuss about that. There's two major types that you could lump everything in together. You could do depressions and openings. Depressions being like indentations almost into the bone, while processes are things that like project out from the surface of the bone. Usually they serve as some type of landmark. They might attach to something, such as a ligament or a tendon. And let's go ahead and just dive into it. Here's your list of everything that we're going to be looking at, but we're going to take it piece by piece. We're going to start off with the depressions and openings. A fissure is an opening. It's literally a slit. Somebody took a knife to some cellophane, some saran wrap, and they put in a hole right on down through it with a knife. And just an example of that is your superior orbital fissure and your inferior orbital fissures, the slits in the back of the eye socket. A foramen is an opening as well, but it's more of a circular opening. It looks like somebody just punched a hole in something. They took a hole punch to it and there's your hole. A major marking that you should definitely remember is this foramen magnum. This foramen magnum is where the spinal cord comes out. You can also see other things that are along this skull that are foramens. Like here's a couple of foramens. There's a foramen. There's a foramen. But again, foramen are just like brief holes that allow you access into the bone or into that cavity within that bone in this case. Comparing the two, a fissure versus a foramen. Foramen again is that nice wide opening, with that fissure being more of a slit. One last opening, it's called a meatus. It's literally a tube. A foramen is a brief little hole that allows access, but a meatus is like a tunnel into that bone. And one particular meatus that you're going to care about is that auditory meatus, or that your ear canal. Depressions, we're on to depressions. We're talking about indentations. So a fossa is a shallow depression or indentation. You can see that this is where your jaw goes, your mandible goes, that point goes into that mandibular fossa. It's a nice groove that helps keep that jaw in its place, that mandible in its place. So that fossa is just sort of like that indentation. A sulcus is like the beginnings of a suture. Remember how it has that nice groove to it, or it's a nice long slit, or maybe it's even the beginning of a meatus. But a sulcus is sort of like a groove that you can put a tendon or a nerve into. If you look at your humerus, if you go ahead and feel the more proximal portion of your humerus, and you rotate it on yourself, you're going to feel a bump, an indentation, and then another bump. In between those two bumps is a sulcus, and that's where one of your major tendons for your biceps is running currently. A facet is an indentation, and it's a little bit more different than that of a fossa because it's more articulate. It has a lot more articular facet to it. Projections. We're on to the parts that's actually poking out of the bone. It's not indented into the bone, it's poking out. You got two different types. Usually this is at the end of the bone where the joint is. And a condyle is usually that smooth surface that you got going on. That's a nice lump on that articular surface. Again, articular just means a joint surface. While the epicondyles are usually found above that joint or nearby that joint. And often you'll see, word of thumb, if you see a bone that's kind of porous like this, you can guarantee that some type of tendon or ligament attaches to it at that point. So the epicondyles are often places that you're going to find some type of muscle or tendon attachment. Tendon or ligament attachment. Forgive me, tendons are a part of muscles. Okay, let's talk about another projection, the head. The head is usually something that is at the end of a bone. It's very unique. It's very distinct. Like the top, you have head in your femur, head of your humerus. Forgive me. You got a head of your humerus. You got a head of your femur. You got a head of a rib, radius ulna. There's a lot of bones with heads. They kind of just look like a giant projection at the end of a bone. And just below that, just like your head, your normal head on your body, there is a neck as well, often associated with it. Another projection to care about is like the reverse of your sulcus. Instead of having a groove indenting into your bone, there's a nice thick projection line coming out. This is a crest. There aren't many on the human body, but one particular example that's really prominent is on your sacral bone. There's your tailbone bone. There's your tailbone. Your pelvis would be here and here. This is the back end of your tailbone, and that there should be a nice sacral crest right there. A line isn't as prominent as a crest. This is a decent example of a crest. You can see a line. You can kind of see it going on right here. It's a little bit going on, but it's not as prominent or very well seen as that of a crest. Spinous process. Well, there aren't really many spinous processes on your body except for on your spinal cord or your vertebral column. On the back of that vertebrae, there's your spinal cord there. Here's your vertebrae on the back of that. You're going to see that spinous process. There's also something called a trochanter and a tubercle. Now we're getting to the projections. Instead of lines and fissures or lines and crests and all that stuff, we're getting on to the bulbous things that kind of bulge out. Tubercles are found everywhere. You can find one on the rib, you can find them on your humerus, but the only place that has a trochanter, which is a very, very heavily pronounced, a very large pronounced projection out, aka the trochanter, is only found on your femur. And you can feel that by going just below your pelvis and sort of rotating or moving your leg as if you were walking. You can feel that projection go back and forth. Tuberosity is usually just like it's just the different sizes. It's just sort of like the fits all thing. It fits, it could be large, it could be small, but most of the time it's rough. One thing that is certain about it is that it is rough, it is bumpy. And if you remember my rule about the rough and bumpy, something combines to it, whether it be some type of ligamentous joint or like here in the sacrum between the bone, between the sacrum and the hip, we're going to call it for now, or on your tibia, which actually connects your tendon to a lot of major muscles of your upper leg. With that, that is the end of the descriptions of the bone markings and in general. I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and then the next discussion will be completely on the skull.